Mike McDermott, and in this video we're going to look at two campaigns that demonstrate the willingness of the American soldier to fight. The first, Brandywine, and the second, Germantown. In both cases, the American Army was forced to withdraw from the battlefield, but they did so in an organized fashion, ensuring that the Army held together and would be prepared to fight another day. A little bit of background might be helpful. In 1777, Philadelphia was the largest city in the colonies. The Continental Congress had taken up residence in Philadelphia, making it the American capital. And that also, of course, made it a prime target for the British. Leaving behind enough troops in New York to ensure they could hold that place, the British Army moved to capture Philadelphia. And that gave General Washington and the Continental Army an opportunity and force a fight. And they did that by establishing defensive positions at along a creek called Brandywine. While they were forced to withdraw, the Army held together and was fully capable of fighting another day. And in fact, they did just a few days later. Once the British took up occupation in Philadelphia, some of their troops went into winter quarters at a town called Germantown, not too far from the outskirts of Philadelphia. And that was the opportunity that General Washington anticipated. And he attacked those British troops in Germantown the first time in the history of the Revolutionary War that General Washington and the Continental Army carried out a major attack against a major British unit. Once again, they were forced to withdraw, but they did so in good order, prepared to fight another day. Now let's take a more careful and detailed look at the campaign at Brandywine, 1777. More soldiers were engaged at the Battle of Brandywine, sometimes known as Brandywine Creek, on the 11th of September, 1777, than any other engagement of the Revolutionary War. The fight took place because General William Howe, the British Commander-in-Chief in North America, was convinced that capturing Philadelphia would deliver a crushing blow to the Revolution. He was also sure that threatening Philadelphia would force General Washington into a confrontation where the American Army could be destroyed. He wanted a stand-up fight with the Continental Army. Although the Eurocentric value given to capital cities did not apply in this case, General Washington did respond as the British expected. John Adams, a member of the Congress sitting in Philadelphia, described his impressions of the Continental Army as it passed through the city to establish defensive positions on Brandywine Creek. Adams later wrote, "The rain ceased and the army moved through the town between 7 and 10 o'clock. 4 regiments of light horse, 4 grand divisions of the army and the artillery marched 12 deep and yet took up about 2 hours in passing through the city. General Washington and the other general officers with their aides on horseback. The army I find to be extremely well armed, pretty well clothed, and tolerably disciplined, although much remains to be done. Our soldiers have not yet quite the air of soldiers." Here's John Adams, who never soldiered a day in his life, giving a critical review of the troops as they marched past. "They don't step exactly in time," said John Adams. "They don't hold up their heads quite erect, nor turn out their toes as exactly as they should. They don't all of them cock their hats, and such as do, don't wear them in exactly the same way." While the outcomes General Howe expected proved illusionary, that is, taking the American capital and having a major impact on the revolution. One consequence of his decision to campaign in Pennsylvania denied General Burgoyne's army coming down from Canada in the Hudson River Valley the needed support that General Burgoyne expected. The decision to capture Philadelphia contributed directly to the British surrender at Saratoga. In pursuit of the Philadelphia strategy, a British fleet of more than 260 ships took 17,000 men aboard and departed New York on the 23rd of July, 1777. After making a false landing on the Delaware River to confuse the Americans, the fleet entered Chesapeake Bay and put General Howe and his troops ashore some 50 miles from Philadelphia, giving General Washington's 11,000 men time to intercept the British at Brandywine Creek. The Americans dug in on ground covering the most likely crossing points along the creek, although the primary position was at Chad's Ford, which was on the major road leading to Philadelphia. On 10 September, the Reverend John Trout preached to the American troops, and according to him, the Almighty was on the correct side. The doom of the British is near, preached the Reverend Trout. Think me not vain when I tell you that beyond the cloud that now enshrouds us, I see gathering thick and fast the darker form and a blacker storm of divine indignation against the British. General Howe had no intention of conducting his main attack against the Americans' strongest defenses at Chad's Ford. The British attack opened the following morning with 6,000 German and British soldiers commanded by a German general advancing on the American center at that ford with the intention of fixing the majority of the Continental Army in place. At the same time, General Howe made a 17-mile indirect approach with a mixed force of 9,000 men and crossed the creek unopposed to appear behind General Washington's right flank. The sudden and unexpected appearance of the enemy surprised and put the defenders to flight, despite a valiant effort to shore up that break. Concerning the enemy's flank march and the resulting battle, an anonymous British officer later wrote, "What excessive fatigue, a rapid march from 4 o'clock in the morning till 5 in the evening, when we engaged the Americans. Till dark we fought, musket balls plowing up the ground. The trees cracked over our heads, the branches torn by the artillery, the leaves falling as in autumn by grape shot." Stephen Jarvis, an American serving with the British King's Rangers, later recalled the British attack across the Brandywine at Chad's Ford. The rebels' battery played upon us with grape shot, which did much execution. The water took us up to our chests and was much stained with blood before the battery was carried and the American guns turned upon them. As the British troops, commanded by General Howe, advanced, they encountered Continentals defending a stone wall, and a fierce fight developed on the grounds of the old Kennett Meeting House. The pacifist Quakers were holding a service and ignored the battle that was taking place directly outside their door. One of the Quakers later wrote, "While there was much noise and confusion without, all was quiet and peaceful within." The sound of fighting on the flank was the signal for the enemy at Chad's Ford to make their assault, and they soon forced a crossing, which precipitated an American withdrawal. The British had succeeded in replaying the Battle of Long Island, with a similar outcome, and the American retreat was only saved from total disaster by a series of tenacious rear guard actions. The British suffered 587 casualties, while estimates of American losses range between 12 and 1,300 men. General Washington also lost 11 of his 14 artillery pieces. On 26 September, the British entered Philadelphia, and the American capital was soon hastily evacuated by the Continental Congress, who later reconvened in York, Pennsylvania. Once in the city, General Howe decided that the Delaware River was his best line of communications and detached a substantial portion of his force to capture the river fortifications. He stationed the remainder of his army, some 9,000 soldiers, at nearby Germantown. Robert Morton was one of the thousands who crowded the streets of Philadelphia to watch the British arrive. And he later wrote in his diary, about 11 o'clock, Lord Cornwallis and his division of the British and auxiliary troops, amounting to about 3,000, marched into the city. To the great relief of the inhabitants, who have too long suffered the yoke of arbitrary power, and who testify their approval of the arrival of the British troops by the loudest acclamations of joy. Unquestionably, Robert Morton was a loyalist and appreciated the arrival of the British. And so closed the Battle of Brandywine. Very soon thereafter, General Washington takes advantage of the reduced numbers and the relative isolation of the British troops who had gone into winter quarters in Germantown, and we'll take a look at that right now. On 4 October 1777, just days after the British occupied Philadelphia, the Americans launched a surprise attack with 11,000 soldiers in an effort to defeat the 9,000 British troops garrisoned at the hamlet of Germantown, which was 5 miles north of Philadelphia. With a force of 8,000 Continentals and 3,000 militia, each man carrying 40 rounds of ammunition, General Washington chose to attack a major part of the British Army for the first time in the Revolutionary War. The American plan was complicated and required 4 columns to come together in a pincer movement to overwhelm the enemy. The columns, 2 made up of militiamen and 2 comprised of Continental soldiers, began their approach march at 7 o'clock on the evening of 3 October. The 4 separate forces operated independently and were unable to coordinate their movements as they were marching on separate roads through a stretch of unfamiliar territory. A great deal depended on the judgment and the initiative of individual commanders. The militia columns on the outside routes intended to initially bypass the British garrison and then attack from the flanks and rear, while the 2 columns of Continental troops on the inside routes were to attack the British at Germantown head-on. The Continentals' mission was to assault the British pickets before sunrise and immediately move to the attack. The combination of marching at night for various distances on country roads, poor communications between the columns and with General Washington, and a dense fog resulted in a disjointed attack, which soon met with stiff British resistance. The militia failed to become decisively engaged, but the Continentals made progress against British pickets, while enemy units quickly formed for battle. A British officer serving with a light infantry battalion at Germantown later recorded, "When the first shots were fired at our pickets, the battalion was out and under arms in a minute. Just as the battalion was formed, the pickets came in and said the enemy were advancing in force. We gave the rebels a volley, cheered, and charged them. On our charging, they gave way on all sides, but again and again renewed their attack with fresh troops and greater force. We charged them twice more, till the battalion was so reduced by killed and wounded that the bugle was sounded to retreat. This was the first time we had retreated from the Americans, and it was with great difficulty we could get our men to obey our orders. During the American assault on Germantown, 120 British soldiers barricaded themselves in a stone house in the town. Repeated American attacks, supported by 4 cannon, failed to force their surrender. Casualties were heavy among the Continentals, and that included Lieutenant John Marshall of the Virginia line, who was wounded trying to get into the building. Several soldiers did get inside, but were killed or captured by the British defenders, who remained defiant throughout the day. In the fog and confusion, 2 American brigades got caught up in a serious exchange of friendly fire. That also caused casualties. The battle was often at close quarters, in the fog and the smoke, and at one point the enemy line was broken by a spirited charge. General Washington rode to where the action was heaviest, conspicuously leading by his personal example. The deciding factor in the battle, in the view of one American, a private, Joseph Martin, was a shortage of ammunition. The enemy were retreating before us until the 1st Division that was engaged had expended their ammunition. Our people, who, for want of ammunition and reinforcements, were obliged to retreat, which ultimately resulted in the rout of our whole army. When ammunition did run short and no resupply arrived, the American troops, in the thick of the fight, began to pull back, and they were pushed hard by the British. Nearby units joined their withdrawal, and General Washington ordered a retreat, leaving the battlefield to the British, who pursued for about 9 miles before returning to their garrison at Germantown. Following the withdrawal from the battle, an American officer named Tom Paine wrote, "The retreat was extraordinary. Nobody hurried themselves. Everybody marched his own pace, and the enemy kept a civil distance behind us." General Washington's stock rose, particularly with members of the Continental Congress, who admired his willingness to attack the enemy. American casualties totaled 152 men killed, 521 wounded, and 438 taken prisoner. British losses were 71 killed, 448 wounded, and 14 missing. That night, General Washington consolidated the army 24 miles to the west of Germantown. He attempted to lure the British into another battle, but after probing the American positions, General Howe withdrew and went into winter quarters in Philadelphia. At that point, General Washington decided to move the troops to Valley Forge to wait out the 3rd winter of the war. Valley Forge. Conditions were unbelievably harsh for the 12,000 Continental soldiers encamped that winter. Valley Forge became a survival experience where roughly 2,500 men died from malnutrition and exposure to the weather. That winter, 635 officers resigned their commissions and returned home rather than persevere with the army. So everything that we've ever heard or thought about the trials at Valley Forge appeared to be true. When the troops arrived, there was absolutely nothing to receive them. They cut down trees, dug holes in the ground, built cabins over those holes, roofed their log cabins, and simply persevered for the course of the winter. And that closed the campaigns of 1777. Both Brandywine and Germantown were defeats in the sense that the American army was forced to withdraw from the field. But in both cases, General Washington was learning his trade. the American Army was holding together, and with the proper kind of support, the Army and General Washington were ready to renew the war with the arrival of spring. I appreciate any comments that you have concerning the way in which these stories have been researched and put together. Please let me know what you think. And until the next video is up, God bless each and every one, and God bless our United States of America.